Your tree is gone. By tomorrow, that land will be our parking lot.
The HOA president waited until I was 4 states away, sent a chainsaw crew onto my property, ripped out my survey markers, and cut down a 200-year-old oak so she could pave 12 parking spaces for her clubhouse. By the time I got home, the tree was gone. 48 hours later, her brand new parking expansion was frozen. The contractor had walked off the job. County officials were photographing the stump. Nobody would pour another foot of asphalt. And Melissa Crane, the woman who had personally authorized the cutting, was suddenly calling everyone she knew, trying to understand how one tree had brought her entire project to a dead stop. She thought she had removed an obstacle. What she had actually removed was a protected tree sitting inside a recorded preservation area, tied directly to my parcel. And I knew that because I'm a consulting arborist who had spent nearly 30 years reading exactly the kind of land and conservation records Melissa never bothered to check. There was one county document she should have found before anyone started a chainsaw. She didn't. I didn't scream at her. I didn't threaten the crew. I took photographs, made copies, and let the paperwork speak. If you like watching bullies with clipboards discover that real property rights still have teeth, subscribe. Because the first estimate put Melissa's mistake near $300,000. But the money wasn't what scared the HOA board. Once we traced the authorization she signed to remove that tree, we found something Melissa had been hoping nobody would ever ask about. And that was when the real trouble started. Let me back up. That oak had been standing there long before Melissa Crane ever put an HOA badge on her blazer. The house belonged to my father before it belonged to me. It sat on just under 3 acres at the edge of what eventually became Cedar Ridge Estates, a polished subdivision of stone mailboxes, manicured lawns, matching entrance signs, and a clubhouse that looked more like a private resort than a neighborhood building. Our property was different. Older house, gravel driveway, weathered workshop, an old pickup that usually needed washing, and one enormous white oak near the eastern boundary. My father used to say the tree was the only thing on the property older than every argument people would eventually have about the property. He wasn't wrong. I'm Daniel Mercer. I'm 58, and I've spent most of my adult life working as a consulting arborist and plant specialist. I've inspected storm-damaged trees, testified in property disputes, reviewed conservation plans, worked with surveyors, attorneys, developers, and homeowners. And I've spent more hours reading county records than most people would consider healthy. But Melissa didn't know any of that. To her, I was the man next door with muddy boots, an old truck, and a house that didn't quite match Cedar Ridge's preferred image. And for years, that was fine. I wasn't part of their HOA. Never had been. My father had kept our parcels separate when the surrounding farmland was sold to a developer decades earlier. Cedar Ridge simply grew around us. First came the houses, then the clubhouse, then the pool and tennis courts. Eventually they built a parking lot that stopped about 30 feet short of my oak. That tree mattered to me for reasons Melissa would never understand. When I was 12, my father hung a tire swing from one of the lower limbs. When my mother died, we sat beneath it after the funeral because neither of us wanted to go back inside the house. Years later, when my father was getting sick, he would still walk out there in the evenings and put one hand against the trunk. One evening he looked at me and said, "Whatever they build around us, Danny, this tree stays." So I made sure it did. I had it inspected regularly. I kept records on its condition. I knew its approximate age. I knew the spread of its root zone. And I knew exactly where it stood in relation to my property line. Melissa Crane knew none of that. What she knew was that Cedar Ridge had a parking problem. At the beginning of April, she showed up at my door carrying a rolled set of plans. She didn't ask me about the tree. She pointed straight past me toward it. "We need that section for 12 additional parking spaces." I looked at the plans. Then I looked at her. "That section is my property. Melissa smiled like I had misunderstood something obvious. No, Mr. Mercer. According to our development map, that's future common access. I handed the plans back. Then show me the recorded easement. Her smile disappeared. And that was the first moment I realized Melissa wasn't asking for my land. She had already decided it belonged to her. Melissa didn't leave. Instead, she unrolled the plans across the hood of my truck like she was presenting a decision that had already been made. The drawing showed the clubhouse parking lot extended straight toward my property. 12 new spaces, a landscape divider, and exactly where my oak stood, a neat gray rectangle labeled Future Parking Expansion. I tapped the paper. You drew parking spaces on land you don't own. Melissa folded her arms. This expansion benefits the entire community. That doesn't change the property line. She gave me the kind of smile people use when they think patience is the same thing as surrender. Mr. Mercer, Cedar Ridge has more than 300 homeowners. We have events, board meetings, pool traffic, emergency vehicles. That strip has always been treated as part of the clubhouse access area. Used near my land isn't the same as owned by your HOA. Her property manager shifted beside her. Melissa didn't. She started talking about property values, then safety, then emergency access, then community standards. Every sentence sounded official without answering the one question I had asked. Where was the recorded easement? Finally, Melissa said the HOA's attorney had already reviewed the development documents. I held out my hand. Great, send me what he reviewed. Her jaw tightened. You're making this unnecessarily difficult. No, I'm asking you to prove you have a legal right to build on my parcel. That was when the tone changed. Melissa looked past me toward my house, my gravel driveway, the workshop, and my old truck. Then she said, You know, most people would be happy the neighborhood is investing this much money beside their property. There it was. Not law. Not ownership. Status. Cedar Ridge was polished stone and trimmed hedges. My place was an older house with a workshop and dirt on the tires. To Melissa, that apparently meant I should be grateful just to stand next to her community. I rolled the plans back up and handed them to her. The tree stays. The land stays. Don't send anyone onto my property. Melissa took the plans. Then she said something I remembered later, almost word for word. We gave you the opportunity to cooperate voluntarily. I stared at her. Voluntarily? She smiled again. We'll handle the rest through the proper channels. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the Cedar Ridge HOA. It accused me of obstructing a planned community safety improvement, which was interesting, because I wasn't a member of Cedar Ridge. And the HOA had just put in writing that it intended to control land it didn't own. The certified letter didn't scare me, mostly because it didn't prove anything. It quoted HOA policy, mentioned emergency access, warned that continued obstruction could expose me to legal action. But nowhere in 3 pages did it include a deed. No easement. No recorded right to use my land. So I replied once, in writing. I told them the parcel was private property. The tree stood entirely inside my boundary, and no contractor, employee, board member, or representative of Cedar Ridge had permission to enter. Then I saved the email. 2 days later, I left for a professional arborist conference in Missouri. I was supposed to be gone 4 nights. On the second morning, my phone rang at 7:18. It was my neighbor, Tom. He didn't say hello. He said, Daniel, there are chainsaws behind your house. For a second, I thought he meant storm cleanup. Then I heard one running through the phone. I opened my security camera app. 3 trucks were parked beside the clubhouse. A tree crew had crossed onto my side of the boundary. One man was feeding rope through the lower branches. Another was cutting into the trunk. And Melissa Crane was standing near the parking lot in a white jacket, holding the same rolled plans she had brought to my house. I called her immediately. She answered on the 4th ring. What are you doing? Her voice was calm. The board approved the expansion. I told you in writing nobody had permission to enter my property. Mr. Mercer, this has already been reviewed. Stop the crew. She sighed. You can argue about the property line when you get back. Then she hung up. By the time I reached the tree company, the main trunk was already coming down. Tom sent me the video. 200 years of growth hit the ground in less than 10 seconds. I watched it from a hotel hallway, 800 miles from home. I didn't call Melissa back. I didn't give her another warning. At that point, warnings were over. I changed my flight and got home that evening. The first thing I smelled was fresh-cut oak, then asphalt. The canopy that had shaded the east side of the property my entire life was gone. All that remained was a stump nearly 5 feet across, bright sawdust scattered through the grass, and orange paint marking the outline of 12 parking spaces. 2 survey stakes that had been there when I left were missing. A gravel base had already been spread across part of the disturbed ground. Melissa was still there. She looked at me, then at the stump. The board made a decision. I walked past her, put one hand on the exposed wood, then took out my phone. I photographed the stump, the tire tracks, the missing markers, the paint lines, the equipment, the crew numbers, the asphalt edge. Melissa watched me for a minute. Then she said, "You're wasting your time." I looked at her. "No. I took one more picture. You just made this very easy." She thought the tree was gone. What she didn't understand was that once it hit the ground, the argument stopped being about what she wanted to build. Now it was about what she had destroyed. I didn't argue with Melissa again that night. There was nothing left to argue about. The tree was down. The crew had crossed the boundary, and she had already told me, in her own voice, that the board approved it. So I did what I'd spent 30 years telling clients to do when a property dispute stopped being theoretical. I started a file. First, I photographed the stump from every angle. Then I measured it. 4 feet, 11 inches across at the widest point. I documented the tire tracks where the crew had crossed onto my parcel. The orange parking lines, the locations where my survey stakes had been. Then I pulled up older photographs from my phone. There they were, same yard, same tree, same stakes. Still standing 3 days earlier. That mattered. The next morning, I called the tree company. At first, the owner was defensive. He told me his crew had been hired by Cedar Ridge and had been assured the work was authorized. I asked one question. Who gave you that assurance? There was a pause. Then he said, the HOA president. I asked him to send me the work order. He hesitated. I told him my attorney would request it anyway. 10 minutes later, it landed in my inbox. The document listed the job as removal of obstructing oak for approved clubhouse parking expansion. Under authorization was one name. Melissa Crane. Not the board. Not the property manager. Melissa. Attached to the work order was a site sketch. Someone had drawn the property line almost 20 feet farther into my land than the actual survey. That was when I stopped thinking this was only arrogance. Someone had changed the picture. I added the work order to the file. Then the certified HOA letter. Then my written response refusing access. Then the security footage showing the crew entering my property. Then Tom's video of the tree coming down. By lunchtime, the folder was already an inch thick. Melissa called me twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. The first message was angry. The second was different. She said the HOA wanted to resolve the misunderstanding before unnecessary outside parties became involved. Too late. That afternoon, I hired an independent surveyor. He reset the missing markers. The result wasn't close. The stump sat more than 14 feet inside my parcel. The parking expansion crossed the line with it. The surveyor looked at the fresh asphalt, then at me. Did they really think this was theirs? I think they thought saying it often enough would make it true. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. I expected to leave with a certified copy of my deed and the original subdivision plat. Instead, the clerk typed in my parcel number, stared at her screen for several seconds, and frowned. Then she said, "There's another recorded instrument attached to this property." She disappeared into the back. When she returned, she carried a file old enough that the paper had begun yellowing around the edges. She placed it on the counter between us. And before I finished the first page, I knew Melissa had a much bigger problem than a property line. The first page was dated almost 30 years earlier. It had been recorded when Cedar Ridge was still nothing more than a development proposal surrounded by farmland. At the top were the words, "Recorded Preservation Covenant." I read the parcel number twice. It was mine. The clerk turned the document toward me and pointed to an attached survey. My father's property was outlined in black. The future Cedar Ridge development was shaded beside it. And right along the eastern edge of my parcel was a protected preservation area centered on one existing mature oak. My oak. I kept reading. When the original developer applied for approval to build Cedar Ridge, the county had required several conditions before the subdivision could move forward. One protected the existing tree and the surrounding root zone from construction activity. No paving, no excavation, no grading, no permanent structures. And most importantly, no future HOA easement had ever been recorded across that section of my property. The phrase Melissa kept using, "future common access," appeared nowhere in the recorded document. I asked the clerk to pull the original development maps. That's when I saw what had happened. An early planning sketch did show a possible access strip near my property, but it was exactly that, a planning sketch. The final recorded plat had removed it. Melissa had been relying on a preliminary drawing that never became a legal property right, or at least that was the generous explanation. I ordered certified copies of everything. The covenant, the final plat, the parcel history, the recording references. Then I called an attorney I had worked with on tree loss cases before. I didn't explain the entire story over the phone. I simply said, "I need you to look at one county record." He called me back an hour later. His first question was simple. "Did the HOA know you objected before they cut the tree?" "Yes." "In writing?" "Yes." "Did they have a recorded easement?" "No." "And they paved into the protected area afterward?" "They started to." There was a long pause. Then he said, "Don't let anyone disturb that stump." That afternoon, an independent consulting arborist came to the property. He photographed the stump, measured the remaining trunk diameter, examined the root zone, reviewed photographs of the tree before removal. Then he asked about its condition. I handed him inspection records going back years. Healthy crown. No major structural defects. No removal recommendation. No emergency designation. Nothing supported Melissa's claim that the tree had to come down for safety. He looked toward the unfinished parking expansion. "Who authorized the removal?" I handed him the contractor's work order. He read Melissa's name, then looked at the county covenant. And for the first time since I had returned home, someone actually laughed. Not because any of this was funny, because the paperwork was that bad. 3 days later, he sent me his preliminary valuation. I opened the email at my kitchen table, read the number, then read it again, and that was before my attorney explained what could happen when intentional removal, a recorded restriction, restoration costs, and enhanced property damages were added together. Melissa thought she had cut down one tree. What she had actually done was start building a 6-figure liability file with her own signature on the first page. The preliminary tree valuation was $82,000. Melissa thought that was the bad number. It wasn't. That was only the value assigned to the loss of the oak itself. My attorney started building the rest of the claim one line at a time. The tree had been removed after written notice that the land was private. The contractor had crossed a confirmed property boundary. The work had disturbed a recorded preservation area. The root zone had been graded. Gravel had been compacted into the soil, and part of the site had already been covered with asphalt. That meant the damage didn't stop at the stump. There was soil remediation, removal of unauthorized pavement, restoration of the protected area, survey costs, professional arborist fees, legal expenses, and, depending on how the intentional removal was treated after written warning, potential enhanced damages. My attorney slid a worksheet across his desk. At the bottom was a number just over $300,000. I stared at it. So that's the exposure? That's the conservative version. For the first time since this started, I smiled. Not because I wanted $300,000. There wasn't a check large enough to turn that stump back into a 200-year-old tree. I smiled because Melissa had spent weeks telling me that 12 parking spaces mattered more than my property rights. Now those 12 spaces had a price tag. And the HOA's insurance carrier noticed it too. Their adjuster started asking questions. Who authorized the work? Melissa Crane. Was the property owner notified? Yes. Did he object? Yes. Was the objection in writing? Yes. Did the HOA possess a recorded easement? No. Was there a preservation covenant? Yes. Then came the question that changed the mood completely. Did the board formally vote to authorize removal of the tree? Nobody could produce the minutes. Melissa called me that evening. For once, she didn't sound like the HOA president. She sounded tired. Daniel, surely we can resolve this as neighbors. I leaned against my kitchen counter. We were neighbors when you came to my door. She went quiet. We relied on the information we had. No, you relied on the information you wanted. Another pause. Then she tried something different. She offered to replace the tree. A 20-foot nursery oak. Fresh landscaping. New fencing. And, as she put it, a reasonable payment for the inconvenience. I looked through the window at a stump nearly 5 feet across. Inconvenience? Her voice hardened again. You're trying to punish the entire community over one tree. And there she was, the Melissa I knew. I said, no, I'm asking the person who authorized it to answer for what she authorized. Then I hung up. 2 days later, every Cedar Ridge homeowner received an email from Melissa. She called me a disgruntled neighboring property owner. She accused me of threatening community improvements. And she announced the HOA would proceed with a public ribbon cutting for the new parking expansion. My attorney read the email, then looked at me. She's really going to do this? I folded a certified copy of the county record into my file. Apparently. And that was when I decided not to stop her. The ribbon cutting was scheduled for Saturday at 10 in the morning. By 9:30, Melissa had turned the clubhouse parking lot into a campaign event. Balloons were tied to folding chairs. A banner stretched across the new spaces. Cedar Ridge, building for the future. Residents gathered near the clubhouse. Board members stood beside Melissa. Someone had even arranged for a photographer. I parked across the street and watched for a minute. Then I picked up my file. My attorney walked beside me. The owner of the tree company was already there. Melissa noticed us immediately. Her smile tightened. She walked over before we reached the crowd. This is a private HOA event. I looked down at the asphalt beneath her shoes. No, Melissa, this is part of the property we're disputing. She lowered her voice. You are not going to ruin this for 300 families. I'm not planning to say anything. That confused her. I stepped aside. Go ahead. And she did. Melissa took the microphone. She thanked the board. She thanked the contractors. Then she started talking about safety, growth, and protecting property values. For nearly 5 minutes, she described the parking expansion as an example of strong HOA leadership. I let her finish every word. Then one of the board members noticed the tree company owner standing beside me. He walked over. "What is he doing here?" The contractor answered before I could. I was asked to confirm who authorized the removal. The parking lot got quiet. Melissa stepped away from the microphone. "This isn't the time." My attorney opened the file. "It became the time when you scheduled a public celebration on disputed property." He placed the work order on a folding table. Then my written objection. Then the survey. Then the recorded preservation covenant. One document at a time. No speeches. No shouting. Just paper. A board member picked up the work order. He looked at Melissa. "Your name is the only authorization on this." Melissa shook her head. "The board supported the project. Where's the vote?" Nobody answered. Another board member opened the county record. Melissa waved her hand. "That document is nearly 30 years old." I finally spoke. "So was the subdivision approval built around it." She looked at me. I pointed toward the empty space where the oak had stood. And the tree was a lot older. Nobody laughed. That made it worse. The HOA treasurer was reading the damages worksheet. His face changed when he reached the bottom. 300,000? Melissa snapped. "That's his lawyer's number." My attorney shook his head. "No, that's the current documented exposure. And it may increase once restoration begins." The photographer quietly lowered his camera. Residents started whispering. Then the tree contractor said the sentence Melissa had spent weeks trying to avoid. She told us the HOA owned the land. Every head turned toward her. Melissa looked at the board, then at the contractor, then at me. For the first time since she walked onto my property carrying those parking plans, she had nothing to say. The ribbon was still stretched across the new asphalt. The scissors were still sitting on the podium. Nobody cut it. By Monday morning, Cedar Ridge's attorney had formally suspended the project. And 3 weeks later, the first jackhammer arrived. 3 weeks later, I stood beside the same stump and watched a jackhammer punch through Melissa's brand new parking lot. There was something strangely quiet about it. No board meeting. No speeches. No ribbon. Just concrete saws, excavators, and a crew removing 12 parking spaces that never should have existed. The white lines disappeared first, then the asphalt, then the compacted gravel beneath it. Cedar Ridge had to hire a restoration contractor to remove fill, loosen the compacted soil, and rebuild the protected area as closely as possible to its original condition. It wasn't cheap. Neither was the settlement. Between the tree valuation, enhanced property damages, restoration costs, professional fees, and the expense of removing the unauthorized parking expansion, the HOA's total exposure landed right around $300,000. Melissa didn't personally write that entire check, but the decision carrying her signature was the reason the liability existed, and the board knew it. At the next Cedar Ridge meeting, Melissa Crane was removed as president. 2 other board members resigned. The HOA's insurer required new approval procedures for construction near private property boundaries. No contractor could begin work without a current survey. No individual board member could authorize land disturbance alone. And any claimed easement had to be verified against county records before someone with a clipboard decided it was real. A month later, a flatbed truck pulled into my driveway, carrying a mature white oak. It wasn't 200 years old. Nothing they planted could replace what Melissa had taken. That was never the point. The new tree was part of the restoration agreement. A crane lowered it into the ground several yards from the old stump, inside the same protected area Melissa had tried to turn into parking. The restoration plan was approved. New boundary markers went in. And beside the tree, I installed a small sign. Protected conservation area. Private property. No threats. No insults. Just facts. I kept one section of the old oak in my workshop. A clean slab cut from near the base. You could still see the growth rings stretching back through generations of people who had lived and died before Cedar Ridge ever existed. Sometimes I think about the sentence Melissa said when this started. The board made a decision. She was right. They did. They just made it on land they didn't own, over a tree they had no right to touch, based on a map that had never become law. Melissa had a title. She had a clipboard. She had a board behind her. I had one county record. When the facts finally reached the table, only one of those things mattered. Because managing a community does not mean owning somebody else's property. And authority doesn't become real just because someone says it loudly enough. If you believe property rights still mean something, and you enjoy watching bullies with fake authority get stopped by real records and real law, subscribe. And if an HOA has ever tried something like this with you, tell me what happened in the comments.